Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback and enjoy the story. In the evening, when a strong wind blew, tearing leaves from the trees, a man in a checkered coat stood in front of the gate of a large house. The gold pocket watch glittered in the darkness. The guy tossed them up and squeezed them in his palms. His glasses sparkled and he grinned. The windows in the white two-story house were burning brightly. Inside, a maid in a black dress was ascending the luxurious staircase. Multicolored lines jumped on the vital signs monitoring machine. On a huge bed, surrounded by several people, security, a doctor and a nurse, lay Mr. Wrong. A man who has dedicated his entire life to the country is the most powerful weapon of the Wrong family. A blonde doctor in glasses and a white coat took off his stethoscope and addressed those present. He lowered his head and exhaled, closing his eyes. Everyone present looked at the doctor with horror on their faces when they heard him say that perhaps the grandfather would not survive this night. The 98-year-old grandfather was lying on his bed with the ventilator connected. Suddenly, the wooden doors of the room swung open noisily. Everyone turned around sharply at the sound. The guy pushed the doors with both hands and pathetically entered the room. Wearing black boots and a long coat flowing, he strode towards the bed. A dark-haired guy wearing round glasses, dressed in a beige suit with a red striped tie under his coat, smiled carefreely and said that his grandfather had another 13 minutes and 19 seconds to live. Security guards in black glasses and suits sharply pointed their guns at the new arrival. A man in a brown sweater, pointing at the guy, screaming in fear, asked who he was and how he got here. The guy grinned sarcastically, took out a pocket watch on a chain and told him to speed up his time 100-fold. He brought the watch to his gray eyes, its black dial facing the others. The watch in the guy's hands made a sound. At this moment the room went dark. The armed guards froze with their mouths open. The rest of those present looked at them in shock, not understanding what was happening. Trembling all over, the man turned to the stranger and asked what kind of superpower he was and who he was. With a creepy smile on his face, still holding the watch on the chain in front of him, the guy said that he seemed to have scared them a little and, telling them to relax, he replied that he had only stopped time for a while. The man clenched his teeth and angrily asked what he was trying to achieve. Those present shuddered, not having time to understand what had happened. Sweat ran down the face of the man in the brown sweater and he turned his head. The guy in the checkered coat instantly moved and stood by the bed. He pressed his hand to his chest and turned to Mr. Wrong, apologized for his liberty and said that he would introduce himself first. The grandfather opened his eyes slightly and turned his gaze to the speaker. The guy adjusted his glasses with his hands and, smiling smugly, said that he was Mr. Liu, a merchant traveling around the world. Placing his hand on the foot of the bed, he said that he had only one product. Looking at Mr. Wrong from top to bottom, Liu smiled arrogantly and said that this product is time. Mr. I's Wrong opened in surprise. 10 days ago the city was illuminated by the full moon. A message came to the phone from his mother where it was written that her son could quit his job if it was too much of a burden, since they had saved up $700,000, which would be enough to buy an apartment in the city of Mo. Liu, wearing a beige hoodie and carrying a bag on his shoulder, walked out of the building and, holding his phone in his hand, thought that the average person living in the city of Mo feels tiny, and for this huge city they are like ants. Looking sadly at the phone screen, he thought that at one time, for the sake of his dream, he unconditionally decided to stay in this financially international metropolis. Looking at the people passing by, Liu thought with regret that in this world he was far from being the main character. The guy stopped among a crowd of people at a red traffic light, thinking that society is very merciless, and a person is never rewarded according to the effort he puts in. He sadly looked up and exhaled heavily. Looking at the gloomy sky filled with clouds, Liu desperately shouted to himself that he did not want to live such a life. A man in a black suit rushed, saying that he was late. Having pushed people aside, he ran across the road, shouting to let him through. Liu frowned, looking at the man running through a red light at a pedestrian crossing, and shouted at him with displeasure that he had pushed him. Suddenly, Liu's pupils turned into dials, and he froze. A text appeared above the late man, where it was written that his name was Chang, he was 36 years old and had 3 seconds to live. The text above the man changed to say 2 seconds left. The guy looked at him in shock, not understanding what was happening. A sharp red car swerved onto the road and hit a man as 0 seconds was written above him. Liu opened his eyes in shock. Thunder sounded in the cloudy sky. Sheets of paper that had fallen out of the man's bag slowly fell to the ground, and the sudden rain began dripping onto the body, bleeding. The guy stood motionless when the light turned green and everyone started running, shouting that they needed to call the police and an ambulance. Drops of rain ran down Liu's face, who was in shock. A crowd of people gathered around the dead man. A text appeared above each person indicating their name, age, and amount of time remaining. His face was distorted with horror and the realization that the guy could see how long they had left to live. He grabbed his head with his hands, not knowing if he was hallucinating. Liu looked at the hand next to his face. Retracting his hand, he stared at her in shock. A gold pocket watch appeared in the open palm. Looking carefully at the dial, the guy pressed the watch button. The city darkened. The guy raised his hand and placed his palm under the raindrops hanging in the air. He looked around and, seeing people frozen, wondered if he had stopped time. Lou approached the man with doubts. He carefully extended his hand to his back. The place of contact sparkled. Lou removed his hand, entangled in green threads that were reaching towards the man. Tensing, the guy looked up. The text above the man said he had 31 years, 78 days, 12 hours, 56 minutes and 32 seconds to live. Suddenly the lifetime changed, shortening by several minutes. The guy looked fearfully at the hand with green threads. Raising his hand, he threw the thread aside. Green magical energy flew towards the girl. Having reached the frozen stranger, the energy flared up. Above it was written that her remaining time was 9 years, 15 days, 3 hours, 12 minutes. Suddenly, time changed, increasing by the minutes that had been taken from the man. The guy froze in shock with his hand outstretched. Laughing maliciously, he realized that he had acquired an extraordinary ability. Smiling contentedly, he squeezed the watch in his hands and said that time was now in his hands. Looking around at the towering skyscrapers of the huge city, Lou thought that this was his chance to change his fate. He adjusted his glasses with his hand and, eyes flashing, shouted that this was his chance to get out of the trap. Passing by people, the guy with a crazy smile thought that now he controls time and can control the duration of human lives. Smirking, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers, wondering how many people in this city fight for money and position tooth and nail, but the main thing is time. The sky was brightening over thousands of houses. People began to move again. Time passed. Lou smiled venomously and thought that although time is impartial and equal for everyone, the value of the same amount of time is different for everyone, and if he becomes a time merchant, he will be able to control the life of any person. Time rises above everything in this city. The guy thought that when the time came, all the elite in this world would go crazy over him. It was raining in the city. Lou sat hunched over on the sofa. On the wooden table there was a jug, a glass of water, and an open notebook where the guy was writing something. Hearing the sound, he turned around. A girl with dark hair tied in a ponytail entered the room and, starting to take off her shoes, tiredly said that she was completely wet and she needed to quickly change clothes. The corners of the lips on the guy's face rose. Raindrops ran down her body in a tight black suit. Yang flinched when she noticed the guy. She looked in surprise at the confidently smiling guy who raised his hand in a greeting gesture. Holding the key in her hand, she asked in confusion if she had disturbed him. Smiling softly, Lou replied that everything was fine. The girl became embarrassed and blushed without saying anything else. She turned away, heading into the room, and wondered what was wrong with Lou today, because he usually looked so dejected. Looking around again, she wondered why the guy was so attractive today. With a satisfied look, Lou, crossing his legs, turned around and continued writing. The blushing girl squeezed her body with her hands and, shaking her head, told herself to get ready because she had set herself the goal of marrying a rich man. As she approached the door, she told herself that she shouldn't think about any ordinary guy. Opening the door, Yang turned her head and, smiling politely, said that she would go to her room, and the guy should also go to rest early, and thought that he didn't have a mansion in the city center and several tens of millions in his account. The door slammed shut, and from behind it came a wish for good dreams. The guy looked up from his notepad and smiled sarcastically, without answering. Adjusting his glasses on his nose, he exhaled and said with a smile that a beautiful and smart girl who adheres to her principles is not for ordinary guys. His teeth showed in a smile because he was no longer ordinary. In a notebook, he drew up a sample contract for the sale of time, which included conditions prohibiting disclosure of information, finding out information about the seller, giving false information about income, terminating the transaction, and in case of violation of the contract, the time remaining for the buyer is reduced depending on the severity of the violation. The guy thought that he was able to control time and could now sell and buy it like a simple commodity. Looking at the drawn-up contract, Lou decided that from that moment on he would become a time trader. Closing the notebook, the guy thought that he could buy time from other people and resell it at a higher price to those in need. Lou threw his arms over the back of the sofa and wondered who would be lucky enough to become his first client. People were walking around high-rise buildings. A row of lanterns illuminated the street. The guy was sitting on a wooden bench. In his hands was a small black suitcase in which he had put almost all the necessary savings. He looked up, his eyes turning into dials. People walked down the street in an endless stream, and information about the time remaining to them appeared above their heads. Looking from one to the other, Lou wondered who his conditions would suit. The guy took off his glasses. Lowering his head, he exhaled, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and thought that although he could make a deal to buy time with any person, he still wanted them to live longer because human life is precious. Putting his square glasses back on, Lou turned around sharply when he heard the guy promise someone that he would soon save up money for her to buy an iPhone. A guy in a brown bear costume, holding a mask removed from his head and holding a phone to his ear, told his interlocutor that he had gotten several part-time jobs and would definitely be able to give her a big gift for her birthday. The guy shuddered when he heard a man in a suit jump out from around the corner, shouting that he shouldn't shirk from work because he still had a lot of leaflets to hand out, and said goodbye to the girl, ending the conversation. Lou watched the guy carefully. He, wearing a bear costume, walked among the crowd of people with a pack of leaflets and handed them out, and above his head the text said that his name was Zhang and he had 65 years left. Lou smiled, thinking that the guy seemed to urgently need money. Looking at the bear's back, he decided that this was his first client. The man in the suit handed a couple of bills to the guy, saying that he should be fined for shirking work, but looking at his honesty, he would not do this. The guy in the beige sweater bowed low to the leaving man and energetically thanked him. Exhaling, Zhang looked at the bills in his hands and said that there was still a lot missing, so we had to work harder. Jumping up and raising his hand clenched in a fist, he cheerfully shouted that after lunch he would continue to try and would definitely buy a phone for his goddess, no matter what. A guy's voice came from a building with numerous signs on it, asking for the cheapest noodles. Having taken off his jacket, Zhang sat at a round table near the window and threw back his head exhaustedly. Suddenly, a guy in a white shirt approached him. Lou placed the suitcase with a crash on the table at which the surprised guy was sitting. Zhang stared at the guy who sat down at the table with him and asked who he was. Lou, looking into the student's eyes, raised the watch to his face with the dial away from himself and said to slow down time 100 times. Time has stood still in the city. The food splashing on the plate froze in the air. The man froze, raising the noodle chopsticks to his mouth. Zhang jumped up in shock, dropping his chair, and asked what was going on. All the people sitting at the cafe tables and eating food stopped moving. Zhang turned his head to the guy and asked in fear what he had done and who he was. Lou adjusted his glasses and said with a smile that he only made small changes to our time flow, and now time is different from the rest. The cook in the kitchen, preparing noodles, froze. Lou said that now the sounds and movements in the outside world have slowed down, almost completely stopped. Zhang jumped back, hitting his back against the wall, and asked in horror why he needed it. Leaning his hand on the table, the guy in the shirt stood up. Zhang looked at him with fear on his face. Lou put his hand on his heart and introduced himself with a smug smile, saying that he was a time trader. The student chuckled nervously, saying that he had never heard of time traders and asking if he was sick. Lou looked at the guy with a grin. There was a clock hanging on the wall, with the second hand moving very slowly. Shrinking his whole body, Zhang fell silent. The guy with glasses sat imposingly on a chair and, closing his eyes and raising his hand, turned to his interlocutor and said not to be nervous, saying that for countless years he wandered into this world to buy people's time, life expectancy, and to resell it those in need and those who have the opportunity. Zhang looked up and warily asked how he knew his last name. The time trader exhaled with a grin. He raised his hand, from which red fire flew out. Red text appeared above the hand, telling Zhang's name, age, and remaining time. The guy raised his eyebrows in shock. Resting his head on his hand, Lou said that it looked like the guy would live at least until he was 80 years old, which was a long life indeed. Looking greedily at the guy, Lou asked if he would like to sell him some time. Zhang clenched his hands on his knees. After hesitating, he opened his mouth slightly and asked if it was really possible to sell time. Directing his gaze full of hope, he asked at what price. The suitcase moved noisily towards the guy. The clasp clicked loudly. The suitcase lid swung open. The open suitcase contained rows of red bills. Lou, looking at the guy seriously, replied that the price would depend on how valuable he created in a year, but since he was just a student now, Lou would like to buy a year of his time for 300,000. The guy froze in front of the open suitcase. He swallowed, thinking that most ordinary people didn't earn that much in a year. Drops of sweat were running down his face. He thought that then he would have to sell a year of his life, and this would be a huge loss. Lou threw up his hand, from which blue flames flew. A sheet of paper with a picture of a clock mechanism appeared in his hand. Raising the sheet to his face, Lou said that if the guy decides to sell a year of his life, then let him write his name here. The student's pupils narrowed. He was silent in horror. Standing in a black t-shirt, the dark-haired guy asked himself, after all, he will live a long time, even without selling a year, but he will be able to immediately buy a gift for the girl. Looking intently into the void, he thought that he himself would be able to buy himself the things he had long wanted. With a serious expression on his face, Zhang reflected that a part-time job was a waste of time anyway. With his hands folded in his lap, the time trader asked if the guy had thought everything through. Lou stood up, saying that he would go if Zhang could not make up his mind to take such a chance. Sharply clenching his teeth, the guy shouted, asking him to stop. Looking decisively at the merchant, he said that he was selling. The guy in the glare glasses smiled smugly. He put the contract on the table and asked to sign. Nearby lay a suitcase with stacks of money. Zhang took a pen and reached for a piece of paper. There was fear in his eyes and he swallowed. The guy signed the contract in the lower corner. Suddenly he jumped back as the paper began to evaporate. Yellow magical intertwining threads appeared. They came from Lu's chest. The merchant sharply turned his gaze to the guy. He looked back questioningly. Above his head, time decreased by 1 year. The guy relaxedly lowered his head and, raising his hand, said that the deal had been completed. He snapped his fingers. The people in the cafe began to move again and continued to eat as if nothing had happened. Zhang looked around in surprise. The guy in the shirt closed the suitcase and moved it towards Zhang, saying that now it belongs to him. The student put his hands on the table. Smiling contentedly, he thought that now he could buy not only a phone, but also sneakers with an attachment. The guy looked up when he heard Lu address him. The time trader, holding the card between his fingers, said with a smile that this was his business card and that if the guy decided to make another deal, he could contact him. He held out his business card and the guy raised his hand to take it. He suddenly clenched his fist and stopped. Closing his eyes, Zhang said that he had already lost a whole year and it was not worth it. The guy nodded with a smile. He put the business card on the table. Leaving, Lu looked back and said that it would not be unnecessary. The student sat silently at the table. In front of him lay a business card with a picture of a dial. People were walking down the street. Scratching his head, Lu smiled with satisfaction and thought that the first deal was more successful than he imagined, and now he has a year to live. He looked at the people passing by, asking himself who to sell the year to. A white cup of coffee stood on a saucer. Waiters in suits walked around the cafe with trays, and people sat at tables. Raising the cup of hot drink to his mouth, Lu held the blue tablet in his hands and thought that time is the most precious resource in our world, and now that he has taken control of it, he will have to carefully choose the object of his goal. The lenses of the glasses reflected the light from the tablet screen. Entering a search query about members of wealthy families suffering from terminal illnesses, he scrolled through the browser page. Suddenly he stopped when he saw something that caught his attention. On the page there was a photo of Mr. Wrong, leaning on a cane, and an inscription stating that the head of the second-generation Wrong family is terminally ill. The guy tensed his face, remembering that this is a famous old man and almost everyone knows about the Wrong family. Mr. Wrong is the head of his family, and the Wrong family is very famous and has a centuries-old history. Thanks to their prosperous business, they have managed to acquire untold wealth. The grandfather with his long gray hair combed back is the head of a family with a brilliant reputation around the world, whose importance cannot be underestimated. The guy raised the cup to his mouth with a smile and thought that this was his next client. Raising his index finger and placing the cup on the saucer, he said that his client was a big bird. A bright round moon towered over the mansion in the forest. Multicolored lines jumped on the screen of the monitoring device. A doctor in a medical gown stood by the bed and, hesitatingly, said that Mr. Wrong may not survive this night. The grandfather with long hair lay on the bed, covered with a blanket, with an IV inserted into his arm, and screams could be heard from below, asking if there were ways to save him, because he was very important for the whole city. Mr. Wrong lay with his eyes closed with a ventilation mask on his face, and the doctor's voice was heard above him, saying that his time had already come. Grandfather opened his eyes slightly and thought that he had survived the war, the turmoil, the commercial struggle, had seen so much in his entire life, and now he was forced to leave this world, lying in bed like a coward. He closed his eyelids. He sat up in his thoughts, shouting to himself that he could not die. Slowly dragging his body, he thought that his family needed him because he was their support. He stepped on the ground, causing red splashes to scatter. Mr. Wrong walked forward slowly, thinking that if he could live a little longer, his family would continue to prosper and live another year. He fell to his knees, resting his hands on the ground, from which red splashes flew. Falling on his side, the grandfather desperately said that he would like to live at least one more day, because he really had not yet found peace. He spread his arms and his body flew down into the void. Coming out of his reverie, he opened his eyes, surprised that someone had broken in. Seeing the silhouette of an unfamiliar guy, Mr. Wrong thought with a grin that he was no longer good for anything, since he allowed someone to break into his house. The guy adjusted his glasses with confidence on his face and a smile. Looking at Mr. Wrong, he introduced himself as Mr. Lu, saying that he was a traveling merchant. His eyes sparkled. The corners of his lips rose even higher when Lu said that his product was time. Mr. Wrong's eyes widened in shock. Everyone present froze in fear. One of them, looking at the guy, leaned over to the other and asked what kind of person was able to trade time, suggesting that he was a fraudster. The man, without looking at his interlocutor, anxiously told him to look around and asked if all this was not true, then how would he explain it? The guards continued to stand motionless. Lou turned to the speakers and said that if they had any questions, they could ask them later, reminding them that their father had less than 10 minutes to live. The man in the sweater tensed his face and asked how much the time was, thinking that regardless of whether he was telling the truth, he should find out as many details as possible. The guy raised his hand with the chain on which his pocket watch hung and said that each person in the same amount of time is able to bring benefits of different prices, and money is an intermediary and a measure of the value of life. The hands on the dial stood, and Lou said that 1 year of life is equal to 1/5 of the amount of everything valuable that the client created in a year. The man with suspenders, counting on his fingers, cried out expressively that, according to their income, it was 100 million, which is a huge amount. The guy grinned and sarcastically asked if such an influential family knew that no amount of money could buy time. Adjusting his glasses and removing the smile from his face, Lou said that essentially they were nothing more than a bunch of mere mortals. The man's veins bulged and he screamed angrily. The guy lowered his eyes and raised his hand with a hanging watch. The corners of the bearded man's lips drooped. Mr. S. Son's pupils Wrong's eyes narrowed in horror. The man with glasses opened his mouth. Sweat was running down the other's face. They saw red text saying that Mr. Wrong has 5 minutes to live. The head of the family turned his fading gaze. Looking down at him, Lou said that Mr. Wrong has wielded enormous power for decades, but time is merciless for everyone. Pointing his hand at himself, the guy with glasses said that he was the one who could balance it out. Grandfather opened his eyes, making incomprehensible sounds. Leaning over him and placing his hand on him, the man in the sweater asked if he wanted to say something. Mr. Eyes Wrong was blushing and his body was shaking. He raised a trembling hand. Holding it out to the guy, he said that he wanted to live. The man moved away from Mr. in surprise. Wrong. Turning to Lou, he said that they were buying a year of life. The guy raised his hand up and a piece of paper appeared in it. He handed the contract to his grandfather and told him to sign. The man raised his hand, wanting to stop him and saying that it was difficult for him to move. Lou looked at Mr. defiantly. Wrong, reminding that time is short. The head of the family looked at the guy. Looking up, he saw that there were 40 seconds left. His pupils shrank in horror, and he thought that he still had grandiose plans and he wanted to live. Mr. Wrong squeezed the blanket with his hand. He sat up in bed with 8 seconds left. Grandfather reached for a fountain pen, deciding that he needed to live. Taking a pen, he placed it on a piece of paper with 3 seconds left. Everyone looked at him tensely. Mr. Wrong left a caption when the text showed 1 second. The clock hand moved. Breasts Mr. Wrong rose up, and magical energy flew at him. The man in the sweater raised his hand in fear. Mr. Wrong, surrounded by glowing particles of magic, opened his mouth wide. The particles flashed, lighting up the entire room. The guy smiled smugly, feeling his power. Mr. Eyes Wrong were glowing and the head was thrown back. Suddenly he bent over, breathing heavily. The inscription above him said that he had 365 days and 1 second to live. The shocked men looked at the text, seeing that his lifespan had increased. Mr. Wrong took off the mask from his face. He looked at his hand, not believing what was happening. Lou clapped and said Mr. Wrong is truly worthy of being the head of the second-generation family, and he admires his determination. The grandfather looked up at the guy in surprise. With his arms outstretched, Lou said with a smile that the deal was done. Voices were heard from the White House. The family members stood in front of their uncle, who was sitting on the bed. They asked how he was feeling. Mr. Wrong looked down. He couldn't understand how he felt. Grandpa opened his eyes wide and looked at his hand. He said it was like going back a few years, even though he was still old. The old man clenched his fist and said that he was still full of strength and energy. From the forehead of Mr. Wrong was dripping with sweat, and he wondered, so this is the power of time. The uncle and nephew looked at the protagonist, who had one hand in his pocket. Lou congratulated Mr. Wrong and wished him to enjoy a whole year of life. The main character looked back with a smile on his face and said that it was time for him to leave. The man in the brown sweater began to ask the main character to stop because he had forgotten about the payment. Suddenly, Lou disappeared in front of his nephew. The man caught the piece of paper that appeared in the room. The card number was written on the piece of paper and the words of the protagonist, who asked that money be transferred to him using this number. He relies on their honesty. The man looked at the piece of paper with a blank face. 2 guards with pistols sensed something was wrong. A man with a mustache stood next to his partners. Suddenly, the man with glasses was very surprised. The bodyguards looked towards the old man who was sitting on the bed. Sweat dripped down the man's face as he looked at Mr. Wrong. He wondered how the old man got better, and how is this possible? The elderly man stood with his feet on the floor and said that each of them had performed well today. The entire staff and family stood in shock. Mr. Wrong turned to them and said that they were careful about what they said. All the staff bowed as a sign of respect in front of the older man. The man with the mustache stood with a blank look. He didn't understand what just happened here. Why was no one surprised by Mr. S' sudden recovery? Wrong. The man with yellow hair remembered the silhouette of the main character and said that that young man had just burst in here. Who was he? The nephew approached his uncle, who was sitting on the bed, and handed him a piece of paper. The guy said Mr. Wrong that this note was left by Lou. The entire staff stood with a blank look. Grandfather began to look at the piece of paper. Mr. Wrong squeezed the piece of paper and said that as agreed. The man got out of bed and said that they would pay the required amount. Mr. Wrong went to the window and could not believe that such incredible power existed in this world. Black silhouette of the protagonist. Grandfather said that this power was very different from the characteristics that some gifted people possess. This force literally contradicts all the laws of nature. Mr. Wrong raised his head sharply and said that, however, her existence does not mean anything bad for them. The old man looked to the side with a serious look and said that with Mr. Liu only needs to maintain friendly relations. Under no circumstances should you be at enmity with him. Is everyone clear? The whole family bowed to the man. The bright moon was shining in the sky. Leaves fly between buildings. The main character extended his hand towards the moon and said that control over destinies really causes. Lou stood with a smile on his face and said that it causes very pleasant feelings. The success of past transactions has shown. The protagonist stood on the roof of the building and thought that his decision to trade time was correct. Whether it's the influential family of Mr. Wrong or an ordinary student, everyone is under his control. Lou understood that he controlled the entire transaction process. The main character saw the reflection in his watch and said that it seemed that the role of a time trader was ideal for these transactions. The main character stood in front of the golden contracts and thought that, however, as the number of clients increased, he would gradually become more and more limited in his desires and intentions. Therefore, he needs an accurate plan. The wind blew away the protagonist's tie. On one of the city signs there was an inscription, "A Motorist's Club." Lou saw the inscription and said, "Club of Immortality." The main character remembers all the actions of elite people. As a rule, all the rich and famous people from different regions flock to elite clubs. Such clubs serve as reference points for influential people and gathering places for the wealthy. In addition, the status of participants in such events is a symbol of wealth and honor. Lou is sitting on a luxurious red sofa. In his Immortality Club, he would become the only senior official who determines the club's policies. Having power over all participants will make it much easier to conduct business in accordance with your intentions and desires. A black silhouette stands with arms outstretched in front of shirtless workers. Lou thinks that his directions and instructions will have the status of immunity, and any objections will become unacceptable. Much money. The club will include ordinary people, representatives of the elite and the rich from all over the world. Membership status can be divided into several levels depending on financial capabilities. Silhouettes of the dial against the background of gold coins. Lou said there will be different levels. Level 1 10 million, level 2 100 million, and so on. With each level, the number will be multiplied by 10. White hands reach for the gold watch. The protagonist said accordingly. Level 1 participants will be able to purchase a year of life. Second level participants, 3 years. Participants of the 6th level are 36 years old. Silhouettes of people on a yellow background. Lou said that, for example, the chairman will head the management council, which will include the deputy chairman, representatives of club members, and the general secretary. People bow to the protagonist, who ascends the steps. Lou believes that then his Immortality Club will become the most terrifying and mysterious organization standing at the very top of this world. The main character holds a crown in his hand, with the words that he will be a leader. Lou is standing on the roof of a skyscraper. He said that he would be the leader with immunity and the highest power. People cross a pedestrian crossing. The protagonist put his hands in his pockets. He said that in order to create an Immortality Club it is necessary to find honest and reliable workers. Lou began to cross the road and thought that most of these people had to work with all their might all their lives. The main character exhaled heavily. A yellow car appeared in front of him. The protagonist opened his eyes wide. There was a driver in front of him. Name Zai, age 40 years old, life left 13 years, 58 days, 17 hours. The driver asked if he could give the main character a ride. Lou didn't expect that the man was 40 years old and looked much older. The main character got into the taxi, and I thought that it looked like another person, tired of work and loans, just like he once was. The main character looked through the car window. The driver asked if perhaps the protagonist should be a businessman. He immediately understood this from his image. The driver sat with a smile on his face, which was reflected from the mirror. He said that the main character is not at all like hillbillies like him. Lou adjusted his glasses. The main character looked at the phone, on which it was written that it was not his account that was transferred 100 million yuan. Lou looked at the phone with a grin on his face and thought that Mr. Wrong impresses with its efficiency. They sent such a large sum so quickly. They were clearly excited about the deal. The main character heard the phone ringing. The taxi driver picked up the phone and asked his son if he had finished studying yet. He's on work now. Dad asked how his grandfather was doing. The taxi driver braked sharply. The driver held the steering wheel tightly and told his son not to panic, he would come right away. The man told his son not to worry about the money, he will definitely find it. The driver turned to Lou and asked him to change into another taxi. The protagonist sat with a blank look. Then he closed his eyes and said that there was no need, he didn't care. The main character said that the man could drop him off near the hospital, he would pay for the taxi as expected. The driver thanked Lou. Many cars were stuck in a traffic jam. The man said his son was already in his last year of high school, but according to the teacher, he needs to try even harder to get into university. The driver really wants his son to attend paid courses to reinforce the material, but he cannot afford such expenses. The man said that he couldn't let his son lose face, and now his father too. The taxi driver looked in the mirror and said, "Why is he telling all this?" Then he apologized to the main character. Lou pressed his watch. A red light trail was visible from the car. The hospital was visible from the car window, with money on the seat. The taxi driver didn't understand what was happening. Tang stood with glasses and said that they were able to simulate a miniature of the Earth and go through each stage of the origin of life. P01 stood next to the main character and asked, "Is the plan feasible?" Professor Tang raised his hand and said that the genetic code of each of them determines everything in a person, creating spores whose evolution can be controlled using genetic coding technology is the prerogative of God. Anthony put his hands on his belt and looked at his colleague, who said that they should approach life with trepidation. Tang opened his mouth and said that, however, the creation of this kind of sandbox. The man looked, stood with a serious face and said that it was really possible. P01 looked ahead and asked, "Does it mean that when the right conditions appear, they will be able to create an environment suitable for the emergence of life in this sandbox?" Lou stood with a smile on his face. The girl opened her eyes wide and asked, "And then by accelerating time, will they achieve the appearance of microorganisms?" The main character looked at the girl, who said that by that time they, being the creator of the miniature universe. P01 turned her head and said that you can take time away from these living organisms. Lou, along with the professors, were shocked when the girl said that in other words, they will be able to produce their own time. A drop of sweat dripped down Anthony's face and he said it was crazy. Professor Tango closed his eyes and said that the plan was quite feasible. The main character leaned on the table and thought that the plan was very complicated, but having a first-class laboratory and bringing together specialists from different fields of science. Lou looked with a serious look and said that they still can add to this his ability. The main character imagined how he holds the planet. He said that an evolutionary process of 10,000, 100,000, or even a million years could be achieved in an instant. Lou smiled and thought that he would become the owner of a miniature universe. The protagonist stood against the background of a golden clock dial and said that he could take time from there like bread from his pantry. The main character strained his eyes and said that if they pull this off, Lou stood with a striped tie and said that he would become the owner of an infinite amount of time. Pocket watch against the backdrop of endless space. The main character thought he wanted his own miniature universe with an infinite amount of time. Lou adjusted his glasses and decided that he would call this crazy idea. The black silhouette of the protagonist spread his arms and said that he would call it Genesis Project. The professors and P01 looked at the protagonist, who said that he was now officially declaring. The protagonist stood in a suit against the background of the workers and said that the Genesis Project is now one of the main goals of the Eternal Club. Lou leaned on the table and said that until this project is completed, he will be the club's first priority. The girl and the professors stood in a row. The protagonist said that they must complete various tasks together to achieve this goal. Lou extended his hand and said that the Advanced Technology Project and the Life Engineering Project would tie for second place. Depending on the priority, the club will provide maximum financial support. Anthony and Tang were very surprised. The main character smiled and said that the last ones. In Lou's hand, the golden planet Earth levitated. He said that the Earth's Environmental Protection Program. A golden sphere levitated in the room. The main character said that no project should harm their planet. The professors and the girl looked at the planet. The protagonist said that he hoped that after many years, Lou put his hand on the table and continued, said that they would reach heights that humanity had never seen before, opening up a completely new world. From the cottage one could hear the mood of the team, which understood its goals. Two men walked along the corridor. One of them said that he still couldn't believe it. Anthony's face was dripping with sweat. He said that he was in a state of shock. Professor Tang nodded his head and said that he used to think the same way as him. The man with a beard looked at his colleague with a blank look when he said that he now fully approved of Mr. Lou's plans. Tang, smiling, told Anthony to think. The man's face did not lose anxiety when Tang said that they were supposed to die with him, but now they are here and they are discussing lofty goals. Tang continued to smile and said that if there is a person who can control life and death, then is there anything even more impossible? The professor watched with his brown eye, capable of controlling life and death. Anthony looked back as his colleague walked forward. The man understood that this Mr. Liu was on his way to becoming a god. The main character stood in front of P01. The girl with violet eyes said that since she is now an employee of the club, does she need to now? Liu, smiling, interrupted the girl and said that she was different from these two professors. The main character said that she doesn't need to break ties with other people. P01 closed her eyes when the protagonist said that she needed to maintain the status quo. The girl said that she understood. Liu's smile never left his face. He told P01 that she could bring Xuangshu in here tomorrow. The girl opened her eyes wide and asked why. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that as his confession, he wants to increase her life expectancy. P01 closed her eyes and exhaled heavily. She said that she understood everything. The main character sat down on the sofa and suggested that P01 sit down too. Liu said that he wanted to discuss the idea of their representative with her. The girl put a brown folder on the table and said that here is information about their old friends. Now they are the most important clients for them. P01 sat in front of the main character, who said that he was thinking about who to choose among them, but he became even more confused. The girl was looking at the documents when the main character said that she is now with us. I can breathe a sigh of relief. Liu raised his fist to his face and said that in the end, such things should be left to professionals. The protagonist asked P01 what she thought about this. Suddenly the girl fell into a stupor when she saw Mr. S photo. Wrong. The girl looked at the main character with a smile and said that she did not expect that he had connections with such people. P01 put down the piece of paper and said Mr. Rong enjoys authority in relevant circles and his words carry weight. She said he was definitely the best choice among them all. Liu became sharply alarmed when P01 said that. However, the girl was sitting in a white shirt and said that in this situation it was necessary to meet him in person. She asked what Liu thought about this idea. The protagonist replied with a smile on his face that Mrs. P01 is approaching the matter more and more carefully. He said that from now on he would entrust such matters to her. The girl, smiling back, said that there were no problems. The main character stood with a confident face and thought that in the process of creating an eternal club, he must learn to delegate powers to others and be able to fully control important moments. Thus, he will strengthen his position. The protagonist sat imposingly on the sofa. He understood that then his workers would bring brilliant results in the future. Many men are sitting at a round table. One of them addresses his neighbor as uncle and then warns that the head of the Lai family will be holding a banquet in 2 days in honor of his birthday, and they have already been sent an invitation. A certain man takes a treat from a plate using chopsticks as he looks ahead with interest. He adds that Mr. Liu is more interested in the health of the main person at the table. A man takes a spoonful of soup. He says that this old man has been someone who cannot be reformed all his life. The man in the red suit smiles as he takes food from the plate opposite him using chopsticks. He assures that the chairman is probably very curious about what kind of miraculous medicine the head of the table is taking. The other person at the table frowns and opens his mouth. He asks his uncle if he should say no to the offer, then adds that Mr. Liu's identity is suspicious. The elderly man opens his mouth and brings the bowl to his lips. He claims that this should not be done, since in this case they may cause unnecessary suspicion. The man with gray hair raises and turns his head, puts down his plate and smiles calmly. He assures that if his partner is so curious, he can meet him. An unknown servant approaches the head of the table and hands him a gadget. He assures that they are calling the gentleman. A man with gray hair asks in confusion why he is receiving a call at such an early hour. He puts his hand with the phone to his ear. The man in the red suit asks who is calling him at the moment. He looks away in surprise and opens his mouth. The man says Ms. Tan's name. A man with gray hair holds a gadget to his head. He agrees with his interlocutor twice. The man turns his head back and looks carefully in a certain direction. He claims that he understands everything and says goodbye to his opponent. An elderly man ends a phone call when he presses some button on the gadget screen. The men at the food table look forward with interest. They call out to their uncle in unison. A man in a red suit sits down at the table and puts the phone next to him. He claims that Mr. Liu invited him to a meeting. One of the men at the table opens his eyes wide in surprise. He asks if this proposal is an assignment from the club. A man with gray hair looks down thoughtfully. He says that he does not know the answer to this question at the moment, but adds that the chairman wishes to speak with him personally. Another family member who is sitting at the table raises his hand in a vague gesture. He says in confusion that in ordinary situations the boss publishes the task in a special application, and also adds that this will be the first personal meeting between his uncle and Mr. Liu. The elderly man moves his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and remains silent. One of the men opens his eyes and mouth wide in fear as his neighbor looks at him. This person asks if this visit is in any way connected with the Yunping and Yunan brothers, if the chairman is angry with their family, and if the same fate awaits them as Han Yang. This man flinches at the loud voice. The head of the table argues that this family member needs to learn to remain silent from his brothers and demands that he stop disgracing himself. The elderly man tilts his head down and frowns. He claims that he immediately handed over the recording of the conversation with the Chen brothers to the gentleman, so problems should not arise, and, probably, the chairman had a new plan. The man sadly looks into the distance. He claims that the only way to find out whether this new pattern will be a blessing or a disaster for their family is to meet with the boss. Mr. Liu sits imposingly on the sofa. He tilts his head down and smiles slyly. Yanu points with his hand at a man in a red suit who is leaning on a cane. She turns to her master and claims that Mr. Wrong has arrived at the meeting place. The brunette rises to his feet and smiles good-naturedly. He addresses his guest by name and then adds that he came rather quickly since he expected them to meet after lunch. Waiwen and another girl in a yellow dress watch as the older man shakes the boss's hand. The man in the red suit claims that his family is always waiting for new news from the chairman, while the brunette even wanted to meet the older man. And then he laughs quietly. The chairman apologizes to Mr. Wrong for disturbing him and invites him to sit down. The guest turns his head towards the unfamiliar voice and looks ahead, puzzled. Someone calls an elderly man's name. A girl in a white shirt looks at her interlocutor. She claims that she has heard many things about this man and is now glad that she has a chance to meet her spiritual mentor. A girl with long dark hair looks at the brunette, who hid his palms in his trouser pockets, and the elderly gentleman who points his finger at her. The man asks who the man in front of him is. The chairman approaches the girl. He asks the guest to meet their new employee, who is now an advisor to the Eternal Club, namely Professor Waiwen. The man looks at his interlocutor with interest. He is surprised by the girl's position. She looks forward intently and smiles. Mr. Wrong argues that in the eyes of this employee you can see a huge amount of knowledge and experience, which is not typical for her young age. An elderly man smiles when he looks at a girl with long dark hair. The man addresses Professor Waiwen by her first name and claims that if she could become the chairman's advisor at such a young age, she has great talent. The girl in the white shirt is shy and claims that the gentleman is flattering her. The boss watches the acquaintance of Mr. Wrong and the new employee of the club. He argues that due to the specific features of the Eternal Club, its employees always arouse curiosity among clients, and adds that he can see an interesting couple in the dialogue, namely a representative of the younger generation, who has incredible intelligence and a rather calculating elderly man. Professor Waiwen looks ahead with interest. Mr. Liu thinks that their company should not make mistakes at this reception. Mr. Wrong smiles good-naturedly. The chairman also thinks that the employees of his company should also not forget about etiquette, since the ability to conduct a conversation is also a kind of art. A girl with dark curls looks to the side. The brunette locks eyes with her and frowns. An elderly man in a red suit looks forward curiously when his name is called. Mr. Liu and the girl in a white shirt look carefully in front of them. The chairman points out that he has invited the elderly man to entrust his family with a rather important task. The man with gray hair smiles good-naturedly. He asks his boss what he will need and then thinks that they were finally able to talk about the reason for his visit to this place. The brunette smiles slyly as he looks ahead. The boss in the suit raises his head up. He approaches Mr. Wrong and asks him if he agrees to become an external representative of the Eternal Club. An elderly man in a red suit looks ahead with interest. He asks if the boss really meant this question. A girl in a white shirt sits on the sofa and puts one leg on top of the other. She claims that in the last few years, the family of this gentleman has quite a significant influence in the world, which is why the boss chose this particular person. The man is quite surprised by this proposal. Professor Waiwen proposes to place a fictitious laboratory under the control of the client, while the public, who cannot be privy to all the important details, will be told that the research in this place is aimed at studying biotechnology in its various manifestations. A man in a red suit sits on a sofa opposite the chairman and his advisor. The girl adds that their family will need to start distributing nutritional products and medicines to a narrow circle of people at a certain time. She looks ahead seriously. Waiwen claims that these medications can prolong human life. Mr. Wrong opens his eyes wide in surprise. The professor adds that these drugs will be developed specifically in his laboratory. The chairman tilts his head down, puts his hand to his chin and smiles slyly. The elderly man looks down and thinks. He raises his eyes and looks decisively ahead. Mr. Wrong opens his mouth at the moment. He claims that he understood the instructions of the secretary and his boss. A man in a red suit rests his palms on a cane and smiles good-naturedly. He claims that such a business is strange and large enough that it will be quite convenient for him and his family. Professor Waiwen and the Eternal Club boss listen carefully to their client. Mr. Wrong says that Mr. Liu and a girl with beautiful long dark hair came up with this method for a certain purpose. A man with gray curls closes his eyes. He claims that he will try to guess the reason for this plan. The elderly man smiles contentedly and looks decisively ahead. He guesses that the chairman wants his family to take responsibility for some of the necessary clients instead of the main management of the club, in which case people will only get an appointment with Mr. Liu after careful selection, and asks if his guess is correct. The boss sits imposingly on the sofa as he crosses one of his legs over the other. The brunette claims that everything is really so, and adds that this is who will be their external representative. The guy tilts his head down and smiles slyly as he stares at his interlocutor. He asks Mr. Wrong what he thinks about this state of affairs. The man in the red suit smiles good-naturedly and closes his eyes. He thanks Mr. Liu for his trust, but explains that the position of representative is too great an honor for him. The elderly man tilts his head down with a friendly smile. He claims that he is already older and less capable than in his earlier years, so he asks to be given some time to think about this proposal. The brunette frowns as his asshole glints ominously in the sunlight. A girl with long dark hair shows some hand gesture. She argues that in reality, the number of candidates for this role of representative is not limited only to this man, so Mr. Liu gave special recommendations for the candidacy of Mr. Wrong. But the most important thing is the history and experience of the elderly man's family, which his colleagues highly value as and his personal rich insight into life. Someone looks at a man in a comfortable red suit. The chairman stood up and put his hand in front of him, while the girl was still sitting on the sofa and looking forward without any emotion. The brunette asks to be allowed to point out one fact, and then clarifies that, in his opinion, he is quite hopeful that the elderly man will accept the offer to take the position of representative in connection with certain circumstances. The chairman tilts his head down and smiles insidiously. He explains that this factor is that he will need a person on the governing board of the Eternal Club whom he can trust unconditionally. The elderly man is quite nervous. The brunette raises his head with his usual smile. He claims that he can understand Mr. Wrong's doubts and asks him not to take his words as an insult. The elderly man opens his eyes wide. The chairman asks his advisor to contact the other candidates. Professor P01 agrees quite loudly with his master. Mr. Wrong laughs and claims that he is indeed quite old. Mr. Liu and the girl with long dark hair look forward attentively. The elderly man claims that he did not realize his boss's kindness in time. A man with gray hair smiles and looks decisively ahead. He turns to the creator of the Eternal Club, says that if he doesn't mind, he could entrust the position of his representative to a man in a red suit, and adds that his family will successfully cope with such a task. The brunette tilts his head down and smiles slyly. In this case, he asks Mr. Wrong to try hard enough on this matter. Professor P01, Mr. Liu and Mr. Wrong are standing in a large room and talking to each other. The chairman asks his client to go to his home at this very moment and then wait for specific instructions from the club managers, and then adds that their meeting will end there. The man in the red suit agrees with his boss and clarifies that in this case he considers it necessary to leave now. An elderly man walks leisurely down a hallway as he leans on his cane. The brunette sinks into a chair, sighs heavily and puts his feet on the table as he takes off his glasses. He claims that he expected Mr. Wrong to accept his proposal with great pleasure and did not think at all that he would have to make any effort for this. Professor P01 looks ahead and frowns. She explains that this client is a wise person with extensive life experience who agrees only if he sees a benefit, and then asks the boss to reconsider this particular person for a similar position. Mr. Liu rests his elbow on the table as he touches his chin with his fingers. The professor claims that the main duty of the Eternal Club representative is to ensure secrecy, and if he cannot resist some benefit and competently perform his function, then they will have to destroy him. A man in a suit stands by a dark car. P01 says this gentleman has spent his entire life weighing the pros and cons, but he also knows how to deal with staff very well. An elderly man in a red suit walks towards his attendant as he holds a cane behind his back. The professor adds that just as in doing business, constantly pleasing clients does not mean honest relationships for them. On the contrary, it is necessary to both reach compromises and prevent them. Since there must be sincerity in working relationships, she explains that, for example, their dear client wanted to reassure his boss by accepting the position of representative. The brunette holds in his hand his glasses, which glow under the influence of the sun's rays. He says thoughtfully that older people still have more experience. A girl in a white shirt stands and looks at the chairman, who makes a vague hand gesture. Mr. Liu asks his assistant if in such a case, at this stage, their plans have come to an end. Professor P01 agrees with his master. She looks carefully to the side. The girl claims that after this incident they need to think about another important matter. Mr. Liu purses his lips and looks at his interlocutor with interest. P01 says that their company now needs to create a secret base, because over time they will develop the field of science and technology, they will be able to gradually come into contact with the secrets that are hidden in society. The girl frowns and looks intently ahead. She explains that they accept one fact as a rule, namely that the secrets of a cluster of people and civilizations are the largest part of the hidden iceberg, and then adds that as their eternal club expands and develops, they will be able to attract the attention of various secret organizations as well. Professor P01 moves his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and looks forward. She claims that it is for these reasons that they need a secret base to conduct their research in secret, while the girl believes that Mr. Liu needs to start preparing for difficult times before they begin. The chairman looks carefully at his employee. He tilts his head down, smiles, and puts his hand to his chin. He asks what Professor P01 means when he talks about secret companies. The big and gloomy city of Jing. A car is parked at the entrance to a certain place. Someone greets Mr. Zhu. Two women in suits are standing in a certain room and holding a small document in their hands. One of them claims that they are employees of the research unit of Department 0 number 126 and also explains that this little black book is her identification. A large man in a tracksuit holds a cigarette in his hand, tilts his head to the side and frowns. He asks again what kind of squad number 0 is and then asks the women why they need him at the moment. An employee with short cocoa-colored hair looks forward seriously. She invites her interlocutor to sit down in a certain place and talk calmly. In a certain building, Mr. Zhu is sitting on a chair opposite two women. He demands an explanation from them about how such important people as they are could have ended up in his humble home. A man with disheveled hair leans forward as he holds a cigarette in his hand and frowns. He claims to be a citizen of his country who diligently follows the laws. A woman with an unusual hairstyle sits on a stool. She asks her interlocutor not to make excuses for their misdeeds since they came here for another reason. Her partner with short cocoa-colored hair smiles good-naturedly and nods. She claims that Mr. Zhu is currently an honest businessman. A man in a tracksuit leans on the back of a chair and takes an imposing pose. He asks employees of an important organization to listen to him and not interrupt, and then asks them what he owes them now. One of the women puts her fingers to her chin. She claims that they came to the man in order to pick up one thing, namely a certain video recording. The businessman opens his eyes wide in fear. He asks loudly which video the women in suits are referring to. An employee with short cocoa-colored hair looks intently in front of her and smiles slyly. She talks about surveillance footage that may have captured the murder of her interlocutor's younger brother. The man with disheveled hair is quite nervous. He mentally swears and wonders how these people knew about this incident and whether any person spilled the beans. Someone is speaking to a businessman when he suddenly flinches. She asks the person in front of her to stop pretending. A woman with short hair becomes darker and more intimidating. She asks her interlocutor if he is panicking enough in his heart right now. Zhu frowns and looks ahead when he hears the voice of one of the employees of the strange organization. A man with short hair is called by his first name. A woman in a suit with cocoa-colored curls rises from her chair and looks ahead with interest. She warns the businessman that if he continues to hide the circumstances of this case, he will definitely drag his entire family into this proceeding. Mr. Zhu purses his lips. He looks to the side and opens his mouth wide. He demands that his assistants bring the video recording. A woman holds a device in her hands that records the necessary video. She argues that this is a much better state of affairs and adds that it will be right for Mr. Zhu and his family. A man in a tracksuit looks at the employees of a strange organization. He says quite loudly that although he gave them all the information, he does not know what is contained in this recording, so it has no connection with him, and also tries to express hope for the work of law enforcement officers. A woman with short cocoa-colored hair turns around and stares at the businessman. She tries to convince Mr. Zhu to stop calming down since they just want to find out the truth. This employee smiles calmly. She claims that the affairs of this businessman are of absolutely no interest to them. A man in a tracksuit watches as employees of a strange organization leave his establishment. Mr. Zhu is shocked and horrified as he looks ahead. He reasons that the Yang case has attracted the attention of Department 0 and is glad that he managed to stop at the right time since he believes that it is really better not to conflict with these women. The man becomes more gloomy. He can't help but smile maliciously. A certain task is located in a big city. Mr. Zhu thinks that he does not need to take the necessary measures to achieve secrecy thanks to his new friends from the strange department. The unknown person says that Group B reports to the boss and adds that Mr. Zhu is concerned about the possible risk to his family, which is why the employees were able to obtain the necessary video recording without any problems. A black car is driving down the street of a big city. Someone assures that he will now send the fine to his boss. An unknown person is holding a phone in his hand, which made a certain sound. He claims this is strong evidence. Two human figures are visible on the TV screens. Some person adds that all that remains is to interrogate the witnesses. The employee, who has not yet revealed his name to readers, frowns as his hands are clasped. He asks the first, last name, age and profession of the witnesses. In interrogation chamber number 1 there is a middle-aged woman. He replies that her name is Ms. Chen, she is 45 years old, and also works as a janitor. In investigative cell number 2, there is a man with short hair. He states that his name is Dahai, his age is exactly 40 years, and he works as a taxi driver. An angry and serious man with dark hair opens his mouth as his glasses shine under the sun's rays. He assures the defendants that their organization has found out that several months ago a significant amount of money, namely 135 yuan, was credited to the account of these people, and then asks the people if they can explain where this income came from. Mr. Dahai is trembling with fear. He claims that he signed some agreement and cannot tell, and also asks not to force him to do this. An unknown man puts his fingers to his chin in thought. He asks again what kind of agreement this is, and then gives an order to the employee in cell number 1. Namely, he demands that he ask the woman of neighboring years the same question. The unknown person agrees quite loudly with his boss. A girl with cocoa-colored hair raises her hand in a vague gesture. She asks Ms. Chen what she can say about the huge amount of money that suddenly appeared in her account, and asks if the defendant can explain this phenomenon. The woman opens her eyes wide and tilts her head forward. She loudly assures the law enforcement officers that she knows nothing, she only wanted her son to have enough money to continue his studies outside the borders of their country. Then she calls the boss and assures that she really doesn't know anything useful. A stack of sheets of white paper falls onto the table in front of Ms. Chen. An employee with short, smooth hair looks intently at the witness. She claims that the woman's son lied to her about how he passed the exam and became an exchange student, because in reality he took the money that was intended to participate in the exam and spent it on something other than passing the test. A middle-aged woman takes the photograph with trembling hands. The boss asks her to look carefully and answer the question whether it was worth doing all this for the sake of this person. Madam Chen begins to cry bitterly. She calls her child by an affectionate nickname and mutters something about him deceiving her. A middle-aged woman rests her hand on her leg as her tears stain the fabric of her pants. She can't believe what's happening, wonders how it all happened, and whispers something about the fact that she sold her life for the well-being of her son. The unknown man, who is hiding in the shadows, clasped his hands in front of him. Mrs. Chen agrees to tell everything and claims that she will begin her narration from the beginning of this story. The unknown boss mutters something about how everything is going great. An SUV drove up to a large futuristic-style building. A man in a business suit was walking along a narrow corridor, with 2 more behind him. The man standing in the office turned around and looked at those entering. He greeted the man in the suit, calling him boss and saying that everyone had already gathered. At the conference room table, several people sat on large chairs and looked at the arrivals. The man stopped at the head of the table, greeted the others and introduced himself as Chuan Donglin, saying that he was the head of the Special Investigation Team top-level secret incident. The man looked at everyone through his glasses and said that although everyone was here before they started, it was necessary for everyone to sign a non-disclosure agreement. One of the men looked at him and asked again, the highest degree of secrecy, isn't that too much? The bespectacled man pointed his finger at the boss and said that he had no doubt that he was a capable man, but he must state that he had looked at all the reports. All the evidence showed that this was a common murder, and it was only a matter of time before this case was solved. Xuan Dong frowned at him over his glasses and asked if he really thought it was a matter of time. The man adjusted his glasses and stated that he had video footage, the existence of which had not previously been disclosed, that was taken when Han Yang was killed while the CCTV camera system was being serviced. The man pressed a button on the remote control. He turned to the others and said that when they finished watching, they would discuss everything again. Television static appeared on the large flat screen. In the Eternal Club headquarters building, Robert ran along the wide corridor. In the office, Weiwen, wearing a business suit, pointed with her hand and told the gentleman that she advised him to deal with these points first. After all, Eternal Club cannot be opened to the public in such a short time. Lu Lai stood at the rack, rubbing his chin with his fingers, and said that he understood, thanked the woman for the report and said that he really hadn't before, but didn't have time to finish. He was interrupted by a knock on the door, and they turned towards the sound, hearing the blonde's words that things were bad. Robert looked at them excitedly, holding a laptop in his hands and shouting that he was afraid that they were in big trouble. The guy continued that someone was investigating about them. Lu Lai frowned at him and asked what it was about, but Weiwen remained silent. They stood behind the guy who put the laptop on the table and explained that the other party was targeting everyone who sold time. There were signs that their accounts had been viewed. This was definitely due to large sums not comparable to income transferred to their bank accounts. Photos of people were open on the laptop. Weiwen looked at the brunette and said that it was them. Lu Lai bowed his head and exhaled, thinking that it seems that this day has finally come. He acted rashly in the past. He looked forward, thinking that at first he didn't even think that he needed to hide, because then he was one of the crowd and did not arouse any suspicion. He frowned at the laptop, putting his hand in his pocket, and thought that now is a completely different time. As soon as he attracts the attention of the secret intelligence services, not only will all information about his ordinary life be completely erased. Waiwen stood there, thinking, and Lu Lai continued to think about what would happen in the worst case. Robert, sitting on the floor in front of the table, looked at him, and the guy thought that this would affect his employees. Lost in thought, he looked over and analyzed how they finally found out. The guy grinned, deciding that it was most likely because of Hanyang. Waiwen looked at him in surprise, asking what happened to Hanyang. Was it really him? Without turning to the girl, Lu Lai replied that this was exactly the case. Although he went against his principles, he was still behind this matter. The brunette smiled, saying that the consequences were now showing. The girl looked at him seriously, thinking that, of course, for a person with such a gift it was easy to do. She nodded, saying that although the incident was hidden from the general public, it definitely attracted the attention of certain organizations. Fourthly, the most interesting thing regarding the biochemical and physical laboratories. Lu Lai looked confidently at the employees, putting his hand to his chin, and said that Eternal Club can submit an application in the usual way. They will definitely approve it. The employees looked at the guy joyfully. Waiwen asked again, "What can we say? Were they recognized?" Lu Lai put his hands behind his head, saying that the government will not support them for nothing, so there are conditions for everything. Namely, when their research has results, they will have to give it to them to use first. The woman looked at the guy and said that, on the other hand, peaceful coexistence is their common desire. Now they need to act more slowly and carefully, then they will come to success step by step. She confidently stated that in this way Eternal Club can embark on the path of constant development in this country. So little time has passed, and they no longer have to worry about their rear. Lu Lai sat on the sofa with his legs crossed and thought that although the government had acknowledged their existence, with mutual scrutiny, fear and desire for profit, they had reached an understanding on these few issues and were obliged to adhere to them at all times. The guy's look was very pleased when he smiled and thought that this was the path to immortality. He turned to the stern woman and asked her to notify the wrong family that work could begin. The guy looked at the woman insidiously and smiled. He leaned back on the sofa and, closing his eyes,